were best characterized by their acceptance in the Western world, especially America. In 1928, his autobiography was serialized in the conservative Saturday Evening Post. The House of Morgan in 1926 loaned Mussolini $100 million. In a gesture of friendship, President Hoover gave fascism a boost by graciously receiving Mussolini's foreign minister at the White House. Such international figures as Winston Churchill found his policies commendable, and Will Rogers, after a personal interview, called Benito Mussolini a regular guy. Cole Porter's hit song began, "You're the Tops, You're Mussolini." Even FDR had an affinity for Mussolini, who he referred to in a letter as that admirable Italian gentleman. Prior to Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, no authentic public opinion surveys were taken in the United States during Mussolini's regime, but it would be safe to say that the majority of Americans approved of Mussolini. Many actually admired him as a romantic, if somewhat clownish figure, who, as the saying went, made the trains run on time. This attitude was fostered by a number of sympathetic authors and journalists. Anne O'Hare McCormick, writing for the New York Times, found Mussolini an incarnation of the ancient splendor of Rome, a revered statesman not intoxicated but mellowed by power. Lincoln Steffens, a widely syndicated journalist, waxed poetic that, I quote, God had formed Mussolini out of a rib of Italy. As early as 1923, however, Ernest Hemingway wrote that Il Duce was the biggest bluff in Europe.
There was a comical image to Mussolini which served to soften the more aggressive, belligerent aspects. But if there was a parallel, it was usually drawn between Theodore Roosevelt, a man on the horseback type of figure, who sort of took history, seized history by his own hands and bent it to his will, and reassured Americans that human intelligence and will was still in control of events.
From San Francisco to New York, Italian Americans lionized Il Duce. He gave them a new sense of identity.
Mussolini was symbolic to American Italians, not because Italian Americans were fascist, not even because Mussolini was fascist, but because Mussolini was an Italian. And the Italian American population in the United States, being near the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, felt that Mussolini was doing something. He was getting headlines for Italy. They were proud of the fact that Italy now seemed to be one of the great powers, and this rubbed off upon them as one of the lower levels of the American immigrant group.
For the blacks in America, it took a flamboyant figure, Marcus Garvey, to remind them of their African heritage. In the 1920s, his Back to Africa national movement influenced many blacks. A colorful adventurer and aviator, Colonel Hubert Julian, known as the Black Eagle of Harlem, urged his people to join their brothers in Ethiopia. Blacks were developing a political consciousness. Novelist Richard Wright described their bitter legacy. Our outward guise, he said, still carries the old familiar aspect which 300 years of oppression in America have given us, but beneath the garb of the black laborer, the black cook, the black elevator operator, lies an uneasily tied knot of pain and hope. In the summer of '35, many American blacks signed up to go to Ethiopia. There's no record of how many, if any, actually did go. Nevertheless, the hostility between blacks and Italian Americans became intense.
There are a number of them, riots in Harlem and in Little Italy and Mulberry Street in New York City, and there were clashes reported in Chicago and San Francisco between blacks and Italian Americans. But the most dramatic episode occurred during the heavyweight prize fight between Joe Louis and the Italian contender Primo Carnera. There were riots afterwards outside the stadium and knifings, and some pistol shots were fired. The New York riot squad had a busy evening that time.
At the same time, most American blacks were far more concerned with surviving in what they considered to be a racist America. And we must remember also that these were Depression years, and that Depression years were even harder on blacks than they were on other people. So that the energies of American blacks were spent primarily on eking out a living, finding a job in Depression America.
As for the national policy, it had not changed in the 30s. America was still an isolationist country, remembering too vividly the First World War.
Despite what happens in continents overseas, the United States of America shall and must remain